Good evening. Welcome to Race, Resilience, and Representation, a conversation with local LGBTQ AAPI leaders. My name is Jiwanmall. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Communications Manager at Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. By way of access, I am a brown man with black hair that has some red highlights, and I am wearing a traditional South Asian garment called a kurta, which is bright orange. Well, May is Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and tonight we'll talk about a range of issues that impact AAPI members of the LGBTQ+ community. And we're honored to be joined by two local leaders in our community. Now, before I introduce our special guests, you'll likely hear some acronyms that may not be familiar to you. So AAPI stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander. This community is also referred to as API, or Asian Pacific Islander. LGBTQ+ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, and the plus sign indicates all other sexual orientations and gender identities. Joining us tonight are Mohan Seshadri and Quynh-Mai Nguyen. Mohan is the co-executive director of the Asian Pacific Islander Political Alliance, an organization with the mission to build long-term power for Asian Pacific Islanders here in Pennsylvania. And last year, the group ran the largest voter contact program by and for Asian Pacific Islander communities in American history. Mohan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, Quinn is a director of creative services for Philadelphia's Economic Development Community and a member of the Steering Committee for Philadelphia Asian and Queer, or PAC. It's a volunteer organization that strives to engage queer API folks within the greater Philadelphia area through a range of advocacy, social, and supportive programming. Quinn, it's good to have you here as well. Thank you for your time.
Hello.
Awesome. So both Mohan and Quinn have been very active in organizing and participating in discussions like this one, and we'll hear more about their organizations throughout the conversation. But let's go ahead and jump right in. We want to start by acknowledging the continual violence aimed at AAPI communities across the country. And I know it's been difficult for me to process, and I know it's a much more dangerous concern for others in the community. And the violence is more than physical, though that's what's gripped the nation to finally start addressing what some are calling Asian hate or AAPI hate. So how are both of you impacted by this violence? And Mohan, let's start with you.
For sure, and thank you so much for the question. I would say that it's obviously, every single day we get a new video of a grandmother or a grandfather being assaulted in the street. Every single day we hear a new news story about some member of our community being under attack. And, at APIPA, we work a lot with our local partners, especially in Philly, like Asian Americans United and Viet Lead, to try to figure out how we can stem all of this, what we see is absolutely growing hate, and especially hate that over the last year was really driven by folks at the very top, in the White House, in Congress, really taking advantage of our community for political gain. And this is one instance in a long line of attacks in our community. I grew up 15 minutes down the road from the Oak Creek Gurdwara, which about 10 years ago was attacked by a white supremacist who thought that the Sikh community back home in Wisconsin was Muslim, and attacked them for that, killing 6 people and injuring countless others. We've seen over the last 200 years, the last 400 years, waves of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism, using our community either for political gain, trying to push us out of the country, trying to ban us, passing the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, physically attacking Chinatown, things like that. And so, something that it's important for us, for folks to know is things are absolutely dire right now. We're seeing not just these physical attacks, but economic violence, the devastation of our Chinese and Southeast Asian economic corridors, thanks to both COVID and also the associated folks not wanting to shop at our businesses and things like that. But this is part of a long history of anti-Asian racism in our country. And when folks say stop AAPI hate or stop Asian hate, what we want folks to mean is stop the violence, stop the racism, and actually embrace structural and systemic change that is going to lift our communities up and bring them to the table and actually engage our communities in what we want and need, rather than what folks think we want or think we need. I think an example of that is we've been seeing a call for more police presence in Chinatown and South Philly and places like those as a response to this increased interpersonal violence and these increased, individual attacks on our communities. But we know that our communities are not free from police brutality. They're not free from state sanctioned or state violence either. And we're here to say that we need real solutions for these attacks, and they're definitely impacting our community, especially the day-to-day just mental health toll that it takes to know what our folks and our families are going through. But we need that to be centered around what is going to actually provide real restoration to our community in a way that is care-centered and focused on meeting our folks' material needs, rather than simply exposing us to the opportunity to experience a different form of violence.
Yeah, and this is nothing new, right? And this is just something that people are finally catching wind of. But Quinn, I want to bring you into the conversation. How are you impacted by this violence and the people around you?
I'm personally scared. And I know a lot of people around me are scared too. Mohan mentioned mental health, and it's increasingly becoming an issue that I think our community struggles with a lot, most considering how mental health is such a taboo subject to begin with. Yet the rates of violent acts happening towards our community and people expressing the depression and anxiety that's happening, it's definitely becoming more of an issue than it was before. I mean, I personally have started taking antidepressants this year just from this. And I'm still trying to figure out how to work through it. And I think a lot of others are too. I know one of the things that we're doing at PAC right now to address this with our community, because a lot of people are expressing their isolation, is we have monthly afternoon tea discussions. It's a type of discussion group that people can come to speak at, and it's supposed to be a safe space. It's just providing another outlet, right? And then we also try to offer virtual social events to help with the isolation. We have monthly movie nights and game nights that we do through Zoom. But it's not easy right now. And just like everyone else, we're still trying to find solutions.
I can't help but empathize with what you've shared. And I think the mental health aspect often gets forgotten from these conversations. You kind of answered the next question that I have, but I'd love for you to follow up on it too, about what's being done on the local level to help API folks that are feeling, perhaps scared or re-traumatized. If you want to continue on about what PAC is doing to help people at a time like this.
I think in addition to some of the support and social groups or social activities we're providing, we're also starting to provide some educational resources. So just last weekend, Drexel's Asian student body put on a conference called Empowerment Through Solidarity. And it was quite amazing. Be It Lead actually was a keynote there, and some other great local organizations were there. Mango Consulting and Therapy was there. We were there. We did a workshop on intersectionality. And really, I think just giving a place for people to talk about it, to access resources around this, is a start.
And Mohan?
For sure. So, I think the last year, the anti-Asian violence, but also just COVID in general, has shown just how deep and strong our community networks are, and how fundamentally amazing amazing our community organizations are. These organizations that are operate with often little to no funding, certainly nowhere near the level of resources that other institutions and organizations enjoy. And they're doing the same amount of work, oftentimes in multiple languages across multiple immigration and refugee statuses for folks who are otherwise invisibilized by our political context and by our government. And, at the end of the day, these organizations are in the gap because our government and our institutions have fundamentally failed our communities. They failed when it came to talking to our communities about the virus and providing language access when it came to testing information. They failed when it came to COVID relief, and similarly opening up that small business support and relief to our community small businesses. They are making good faith attempts at engaging our community on the vaccine outreach, but frankly, it comes after a year and change of work on the part of our leaders and our organizations when it, in terms of trying to get in there and actually make these systems better. And so for us at API-PA, the way we're doing this is we're absolutely supporting the work that community organizations and direct service organizations are doing on the ground, but also we see that we need structural and policy change, like the government actually for the first time investing directly in these organizations and in our communities. And frankly, especially going back to the previous beat on mental health specifically, where there is no language access when it comes to mental health that is provided by traditional mental health providers in Pennsylvania. There is no cultural competency when it comes to traditional institutional healthcare providers. There are, other than what Asians and Asian communities and organizations have built, there are no pipelines to actually fix that by providing greater access to Asian mental health providers or providing members of our community greater access to training opportunities or job opportunities or things like that. And so the way we see it, our government needs to step in and actually fund this work and invest in our community organizations, as well as invest in healthcare institutions, especially mental health care institutions, providing this language access, providing this cultural competency, providing these pipelines, because it should not be just on Asian leaders and Asian organizations to do it for ourselves. We live in Pennsylvania, we live in the United States, we live in a society that is more than just us, and it's on our government to actually step in there and support us in fixing these issues.
Mohan, what I'm hearing from you and from Quinn is there seems to be this active effort on the grassroots level, but also from a higher level, a governmental level, to kind of address these, long-standing issues. But I'm also hearing that Asians are often doing the work themselves, and there's this need for allyship or support from other organizations. Are you feeling that?
I would say we're starting to feel that. I think after what happened in Atlanta, we've seen deeply appreciated good faith attempts from other leaders, other organizations to reach out and understand, what we need. And, the way we see it, we absolutely need support on this one issue of anti-Asian violence, this one issue of anti-Asian hate, but really the work in terms of allyship or solidarity or being accomplices, whatever you want to call it, is so much more broad than the fists thrown in the street or the slurs hurled our way. It is, increasing our access to healthcare. It is, ending family separation and deportation policies. It is increasing our access to education, to good union jobs, to a living wage. We are whole people and whole communities. And, our Asianness does not stop or end at the convenience store or the laundromat where folks are being racist to us. And so one of the things that we're specifically working on is pulling together folks in Harrisburg to actually get to work addressing this issue. API-PA helped found and works with a coalition of 14 other Asian civic engagement organizations across the state that share our values and are committed to building power at the state level. And we're about to launch a statewide API issue survey to understand what exactly our folks have been experiencing over the last year, over the last 10 years, over their entire lifetimes of being in Pennsylvania and being failed by our government, and also what we actually need from our state government on the environment, on workers' rights, on immigrant justice, on access to education, on mental health. And then we're going to get to work in Harrisburg building and running a legislative agenda for our people so that our elected officials can finally, for, in some cases, the first time ever, hear our voices, understand what our folks need, and get to work doing their jobs, addressing our issues.
This sounds really encouraging, Mohan. I'm really glad that your organization is doing something substantive with this, because I know that a lot of people have been waiting on this type of action for quite a long time. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes a tragedy to kind of spur that action on. I want to talk about our area in particular, the Lehigh Valley and the greater Philadelphia area. While we haven't seen a terrible amount of incidents here in the Lehigh Valley, we know in Philadelphia there have been a number of incidents, whether they be physical or verbal or emotional. Quinn, if you can talk about the situation where you are in Philadelphia, what is it like in terms of people coming to support the API community there?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm thinking about what you were saying earlier, how we haven't heard a whole lot of activity from the Lehigh Valley area yet. And I have to ask, is that because they're not getting reported? Or is that because it's not getting captured on video? And I used to live in Lancaster. I actually grew up in Lancaster. So I'm like really familiar with that area. And I came to Philly for art school and I haven't left since. But the two worlds, it's very different when it comes to like community and community action and how we support one another. In Philly, I see it happening a lot on a local level with different grassroots organizations coming together. I still don't think that's enough though. I am starting to see some town halls that are being put together on the mayor's level. But it's like, where were you a year ago when this pandemic was starting? And Chinatown was shutting down because before the lockdown, Chinatown was already losing business. Like the economic depletion had already started. I'm actually quite frustrated with the lack of support that is coming together for this.
I mean, I don't think you're alone in that. I think one of the questions we have is something that you brought up. Just because we're not hearing about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Mohan, I wanted you to talk about Christian Hall for a second. That is something that some of us in the Valley are quite familiar with, but some of us aren't. To your comfort level, can you just talk about, what happened and what's being done to kind of confront this issue?
For sure, and I'm glad you asked because I was about to bring it up as an example of something that happened to our community pretty close to the Valley. So Christian Hall was a Chinese American 19-year-old adopted from China by Black and Filipina parents. He grew up in Monroe County in Stroudsburg, not too far away from where you are right now. And on December 30th, 2020, he was suffering from a mental health crisis on an overpass in Stroudsburg, and the Pennsylvania State Police were called. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that it ended with them shooting him multiple times while he had his hands up on that overpass. And what we know is that at the end of the day, he needed care, not cops. He needed folks who were able to address his issues intentionally and from a care-centered approach and not bullets to the chest. He had a toy gun, not a real gun, in his hands. And it took 3 months for the Monroe County DA to even tell the family and the public that was the case. Up until then, the narrative that they put out, that the state police put out, was that he had a gun in his hands and that justified the shooting. And then a video was released showing that he had his hands up at the time. And for us, this speaks to the broader issue of mental health access in our communities, and why Christian was on that overpass, on that bridge in the first place, and how many interventions could have been made by health institutions, by the government, by other organizations to actually support our people, support Christian in the first place, but also for the need to divest from violent alternatives to mental health support, to divest from a mindset and a framework that funds police departments and says that an appropriate response to a child, a teenager having a mental health crisis, is to, pull their guns and open fire. And so we've been working with the family and local organizations on the ground in the area. Lehigh Valley Stands Up, the Monroe County NAACP, since the night it happened, in order to identify what can be done. And right now we're doing two things. One, we're working with, again, Christians' parents, as well as allies across the state, and our own members and leaders within APIPA, to call on Attorney General Josh Shapiro to do his job and take over this case and actually run a fair investigation, an impartial investigation, because what we've seen thus far from the local district attorney in Monroe County is victim blaming and deflection and attempts to justify the cops' action. And what we've seen so far over the last 4 months now is that they're fundamentally not going to investigate at all, much less make it fair and impartial. So we need our state's attorney general, for this case involving state employees, to step in and do his job and run an investigation. And then secondly, we need legislative action on the part of our state House and state Senate in order to fund real, nonviolent, peaceful alternatives to mental health response, to crisis response, so that we're not simply injecting millions or billions of dollars into police departments, giving them 5 minutes of training, and then putting guns in their hands and trusting that they are qualified to respond to these issues in nonviolent, peaceful ways. We need unarmed first responders to deal with crisis situations. And then we also need, again, a dramatic reinvestment in our community when it comes to mental health support, because especially, as Quinn was saying, after the year we've had, we're going to have more mental health issues in our communities. Our communities are dealing with the twin crises of this pandemic and then the anti-Asian racism that didn't start with it, but is certainly on the upswing because of it. And if we want to make sure that the next Chinese teenager, the next Vietnamese teenager, the next Indian teenager who is dealing with all the issues that arise from that, is dealing with a mental health crisis, is met with a care-centered approach and folks who are qualified, trained, and equipped to actually respond to that in a way that leaves them alive and leaves them with the treatment that they need, and not dead on an overpass. And so we're working with allies in Harrisburg and the folks who do policy research and policy writing to draft bill language to be introduced in next year's budget to actually directly fund, through the Department of Health, investment in Asian American mental health and Asian American mental health providers, so that what happened to Christian doesn't need to happen to any of our community members ever again.
Yeah, it's unfortunate once again that a tragedy is kind of spurring this needed outrage and call for action, but something is going to get done, and I think people are expecting that at this point. And I think it puts a face on how that hate can happen here in the Lehigh Valley. It can happen anywhere in Pennsylvania, across the country. I think just the story of Christian is resonating with a lot of people who may be hearing it for the first time through you. So thank you for sharing that. I actually want to step back for a minute and talk about the big picture. This conversation is all about intersectionality, specifically with race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I'm wondering how you personally navigate these aspects of your life. And Quinn, if we could start with you.
Sure. Real quick, I just want to comment on Mohan's last response, that I'm really glad you guys are doing that. And especially with efforts of finding people who are qualified. And I can't emphasize enough on what qualifying, like professionally, but also culturally, like on a basic level of finding access to mental health professionals. Like I spent 2 years looking for an Asian therapist. I finally found one. And I'm like realizing, like, so many people are asking me for, can you refer this person? Like, I need an Asian therapist too. But it matters, right? Anyways, so I'm glad you're doing that.
Thank you. And it's really amazing to see institutions like Mango Tree in Philly set up to deal with this.
Mhm.
But we also know that, our folks are struggling. So many of our folks in Philly are working class. They don't have health insurance. They're not always necessarily going to be able to afford going to a specialized mental health provider. And frankly, I'm assuming that the moment they open their doors, they're going to see a ton of folks, come to them, and they're not necessarily going to be able to handle that capacity. So we need investment. We need our government to step in. We need our institutions to support us in making some change.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Stephen, that's a big question.
I know.
With a very long answer. But my initial response is I take it day by day. Like it really varies. It varies from like the day that I'm having, the situation that I'm in, who I'm talking to, what city or like town I'm in. The way I act when I go home to Lancaster is very different the way I navigate when I'm here in Philly. It's just so, yeah, there's no one answer for that.
Yeah, I was just kind of hoping it would kind of start the conversation. Mohan, how do you make sense of these different aspects of your life?
I think I try. I don't think I actually do make sense of it either. Just to get a bit personal for a sec, we just put up our staff bios on our website. We had to update them after last year because of some staff changes, and mine uses I use they he pronouns, and our digital folks who put it up use both in the biography. And there was a solid hour after that first went up where I was like, oh, should I ask them to take that down? What if a community leader sees? What if a funder sees? I don't really feel like spending an hour on the phone with someone from X, Y, and Z Association of Central Pennsylvania, in our community, explaining what my pronouns are, why I use them, things like that. It's just not always worth the effort. And so I think deciding who I'm going to be in any particular situation, deciding how I'm going to show up in any particular situation, deciding what is the most strategic use of time, and is frankly something that I think all of our folks, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnic, or in the case of Asians who are not queer or trans, just ethnicity, decide to do when we're in broader society. Deciding when we're going to be like, actually, that's not how to pronounce my name. Oh, you're just completely saying that wrong. Or oh no, we don't actually eat that. That's the country next door. I don't actually know the restaurant you're talking about, but I'm glad you liked it. I think that is something all our folks, again, across every spectrum of our communities, is intimately familiar with, and it's exhausting. Just the day-to-day of doing that. And so I'd say it is not something that I necessarily have an answer for, but just want to resonate that, I think that's something we all deal with. And frankly, I think that that's something that our cis and straight Asian siblings and our queer and trans Asian siblings can actually find some place of unity on, in terms of understanding that day-to-day struggle and actually coming together and being like, oh, you deal with it in this way, I deal with it in these 2 ways or these 5 ways. We have the same issue undergirding our struggles. They may look different, but it's actually the same problem. Let's unite and actually fix this.
Right. I love both of your responses because it shows like there's this active work that's happening on a daily basis, and it's so dependent on a number of different factors. I think for me, when I try to answer that question, I know visibly I'm Asian. And I think when I was growing up, perhaps I thought I was invisibly part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I was like, I'm already part of my minority community. So if I come out, that's just another box or small community that I'm a part of. And how much more marginalized will I be? So I think that was something that I thought of. And then you think about how, in my experience, a lot of Asian families are not tolerant of their children when they come out. It's a source of trauma and torture for a lot of people. So constantly thinking about, for lack of a better term, code switching to, kind of—
Great word.
Right, to fit yourself in a scenario where you feel most safe, but also most authentic sometimes. So it is very environment dependent. And I think that there is no clear answer. I think it's something that we revise as we go through life and as we meet people. I'm married to a white man, and so I behave, differently when I go see his family, which is a Southern family. When I was seeing my own personal family, I wore a different hat. When I'm in the workplace, before I worked for an LGBTQ organization, I put on a different hat. When I was a reporter for several years, I put on a different hat. So I just have a whole bunch of hats in the closet, trying to figure out which one fits at that moment in time. And I'm wondering if that's something that either one of you can relate to at all.
You must have a nice hat collection.
It's worn out.
So I'll go. It was something that you said, Stephen, that really resonates with me is you touched on safety. And I think that is a huge driving factor for many of us in how we decide to code switch. And then also what you were saying earlier, Mohan, about like the level of effort. Like whenever I'm trying to navigate a situation, it's like, well, what's my goal here? What am I trying to accomplish? Am I just trying to get through the grocery store and buy a jug of milk? Or am I trying to like stand up and advocate for something? And then is it safe enough to do either or? Like, yeah, do I like say something in the grocery store and then risk getting like pummeled in the parking lot? Or it's kind of scary.
It's an analysis, I think. Like you just have to approach every situation with this like mental plan of like, how much effort am I willing to engage in this? What are the possible repercussions? And I think the people that don't have to think about that is privilege, right? So
Totally.
There are people in our community that don't have to have these mental conversations, which are exhausting because it happens more often than we care to recognize. But Mohan, I'm just curious if what we're talking about resonates with you at all.
For sure. And, similarly, so like APIPA is a base building organization. We're not just here to pop off about whatever's happening. We're here to meet our people where they're at and move them to where we need them to be. And so coming from that framework, coming from that analysis, I think, especially on the effort piece, it's like, on the pronoun bit, on the Asian bit, across the board, it's, can I actually have a conversation with this person that will result in them moving on the issue? Because if not, it's not necessarily worth pointing out the mistake or addressing the issue when it's actually less effort to be like, all right, bye, and move on to someone that you can actually, again, meet and move. But I think about, before I did Asian organizing, before I was the co-ED of APIPA, I ran political work and election work and legislative fights for Planned Parenthood, which is, how I got to know the Bradbury-Sullivan Center. And I was, surrounded by queers, surrounded by trans folks, working on LGBTQ anti-discrimination issues, working on inclusive sex ed, working on abortion justice and birth control access, and defending the Affordable Care Act and things like that. And none of it was very Asian. I actually used to run their Latinx organizing program, and am really proud of the work we did pushing back on ICE, working on access to clean water and clean air and medical translation services in Spanish and things like that. But I think about now and the ways in which, you have to constantly decide how queer you're going to show up. And how much you're going to use your pronouns and things like that, but you get to be fully Asian, and you get to actually, you get to go to work in a kurta, compared to the ways in which, in maybe more multiracial or diverse or white nonprofit spaces where you actually oftentimes have more freedom to show up in, show your sexual orientation, show your gender identity, but your ethnic identity, your cultural identity, your religious identity in many cases is just, it does not show up in the work at all, and you just don't have the room to show up. Frankly, it's a trade-off, and it's folks in some, you know, at the most basic level. Sometimes I think it's folks deciding what's more important to them. But I got to say, you know, working in an Asian organization, working in our communities day to day, is feeding my soul in a way that doing sexual and reproductive health work in other communities just never did. Again, really proud of that work, really proud of what we won. But just, you know, being with our folks day in and day out, having one-on-one meetings with aunties, and they're starting and ending by "you're too thin." You know, come over sometime, and I'll get you a plate of dosa and some vada. And I'm like, there's a pandemic. Can't do that. Sorry. It feels so good. And so, you know, I will never tell folks to make a choice. And I'll never say don't show up as your most authentic self, because we should be creating spaces in our Asian communities for folks to show up, you know, as queer, as trans, as however they need to, just as we should be creating spaces in, you know, broader communities, especially queer spaces, for folks to show up as Asian, as Hindu, as Muslim, as Sikh, you know, as Buddhist, etc. And I can say for me personally, it feels really good to be Asian, and it feels really good to be doing Asian work.
Hear, hear. Quinn, I wanted to let you in on this too. Mohan said that working for an organization like his feeds his soul. You work for an organization that caters to both the Asian community and the queer community. Do you feel like your soul is being fed as well?
The short answer is yes. And, you know, when I first came to Philly, one of the reasons why I could not wait to get out of Lancaster. Lancaster is a very like cute, quiet town, but I needed a denser population with more diverse people and access to that. And when I first came to Philly, I was so excited to find this giant queer scene. Like, didn't know that they had a little neighborhood called the Gayborhood, didn't know like that Pride was a thing, didn't know that they had like a youth center for queer youth. But navigating through college and like my early years of professional work, I definitely I was missing that Asian link. And I can't tell you, when I first met Matthew Wong, who's one of the founders of PAC, and he invited me to help with his organization, and I was like, hell yeah. And it's so nice to be, if you go to our website and you look at our steering committee, there's like 15 of us. There's like 15 of us, like from different Asian ethnicities and all different walks of life. Like some of us work from the city, some of us are social justice fighters. Like we got medical professionals, like financing people. It's a community already in just the volunteering level, let alone like going to the social activities. So yes, to this feeds my soul.
I love that. I want to, you know, one of the biggest issues that I've noticed that specifically impacts AAPI folks in the LGBTQ plus community is something we can call sexual racism. Mohan, can you describe for our viewers what that is and what that means to you, and how that kind of ties back to some of the structural needs in our community right now?
Sure. You know, I think the way I understand it, it's folks, I think the way it especially shows up the most brutally for a lot of our folks is on the apps, where I've seen people just explicitly be like, thanks, I'm not interested in Asians. Or it's oftentimes kind of cloaked in a phrase like no rice or something like that. But it's folks very explicitly discriminating against our community members on the interpersonal and individual level, and specifically in things like dating preferences, where they're just not interested, or saying that they're not attracted to Asians, or something that I've seen, you know, every once in a while is even frankly in queer or non-queer spaces that are set up for people of color. It's you know, it's saying, you know, this is a space, sexual or otherwise, for people of color, men of color, etc. And then they categorize it, and it's for non-Asians. You know, the folks listed as being invited or included are Black folks and Latinx folks. And look, those spaces absolutely useful. Those spaces absolutely important. And our folks are people of color. And if you want to exclude our folks, there are different ways to phrase it. And lastly, I think when it comes to our orientation, I think at the end of the day, issues like this aren't going to be fixed unless the material needs of our people are being met, until our people have political power, until our people are seen as just as much the fabric of broader society as everyone else. So when folks ask me about dating racism, sexual racism, things like that, is it absolutely a problem? Absolutely. Does it have massive impacts on, especially I think, our young folks' mental health? They're coming out, and then their first introduction to the community is just the kind of racism that they could get anywhere else. You don't need to go on Grindr in order to get anti-Asian racism. You can get it right at home.
That part.
Sorry. That has real impacts on our folks, and I don't want to dismiss that. And to me, the only solution I can think of is our folks uniting and organizing and building power, and specifically our Asian communities building power across gender, our Asian communities building power across sexual orientation, our Asian communities building power across language and difference and ethnicity and everything else, and uniting as a single force. Because it's only when we're seen as just as everyday as everyone else that this kind of thing is going to stop.
Quinn, I want to have you follow up, but first I kind of wanted to share my experience with sexual racism too. Mohan, you were mentioning that, when people come out, and they're trying to figure out what dating is and what, life looks like. That was something that I was dealing with. I came out at 25, and I started dating through apps, and the no fats, no femmes, no Asians thing is real. Sometimes more blunt and brutal and blatant than others. And that was my introduction to the LGBTQ community. Because where I was in a small college town in Florida where a lot of people were on the DL. So that's where, you got to identify gays in your community. So I was very much disheartened by that. And I really thought that no one was going to want to be with me, not because of anything personality-wise. It was just honestly a preference or lack thereof for brown folks. So thankfully, I found the love of my life. We've been married for almost 4 years now. But this is something that seriously impacts the community and also takes a really big toll on their mental health. And Quinn, I'm curious about, your thoughts on sexual racism and this conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree that our API community needs to unite on this as a first step. But uniting also means understanding the issues and acknowledging them. I think there's still many people in our community that don't even know this is a thing on the dating apps, or are like totally dismissive of it, right? If you talk to some of the members on our steering committee, one of the first reasons why they joined PAC was for this reason, just trying to find solidarity in this experience on these dating apps. I think as a queer Asian woman, the sexual racism that we face is the same for Asian women. It doesn't change whether I'm queer or not. I still get the solicitations, hey, $5, make me holler, like, love you long time. I remember before Ubers, when I would take taxis in the city, I remember a driver not unlocking my door because he wanted me to agree to give him oral. Like, what? I'm your freaking customer. Get the hell out of here. I was like a young college student. I had I was so scared. And I think I think our community is starting to come to those terms of acknowledging each other in these issues. When Philly had our first, the Philly Solidarity Rally in Chinatown last month, some of the speeches were so moving to me. I got so emotional. Some of them were like dads and brothers talking about how we need to stand up more for our Asian women. And that brought tears to my eyes, because I feel like my entire life, I haven't heard that kind of support before, not even from my own father,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to wrap up our conversation about representation. That's kind of the third part of this conversation. Historically, whenever the AAPI community has been represented in the media, it's often been inaccurate and it often has excluded the LGBTQ plus community. I'm wondering if there are examples that you can share of valid, positive representation and maybe some areas where progress still needs to happen. And Quinn, if you could start us off.
Yeah, I love this question. At our intersectionality workshop last year, last Saturday, we actually came up with a timeline showing, it was like a timeline of history of working together in America, and it was showing intersectionality and solidarity. And some of the people on that timeline, we tried to include recent local examples. And some of these people are like organizations like Viet Lead. They're very good about talking about identity and gender identity and using pronouns, and they're very intentional in working with Black and Brown communities, right? I think that the Philly Asian Film Festival, Black Star, and Latino Film Festival are great examples. I don't think people realize this, but over the years, they've collaborated on programming that shows this kind of intersectionality. Like examples would be like programming on Blasian narratives or like what Japanese Chicano culture. So there's a lot of examples out there that people aren't talking enough about. Where I think we need work, everywhere. But I think we need to work on representation and the way we educate people about what Asian means. And when I say everywhere, I mean from like that little limited checkbox about race that you see on forms, all the way to how we're presented in TV shows and movies. Like how many people that are watching this right now, if I told you that like Indians are considered Asian, would they know that?
Mind blown, right?
Right? If you Google search right now for Asian food, like I guarantee you the results will be Chinese food. Like I go to the grocery store and I see a spice called Asian spice. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like, if we're just so much more diverse than that, and people don't know. And I think it starts with education. I think that's where we need to improve.
Mohan?
There's just so much to resonate with. I don't know if we have enough time, but like, yeah, disaggregated data. There are healthcare forms all across the state where your choices on, like when you go in to get your checkup, are Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, and then other. And I'm like, there's not much left at that point once you've gotten through those three. Like you can name us, and then after that, on the representation beat in data, our Chinese American communities. Who have, some of them have been in this country for 400 years. Some of them have been in this country for 5 minutes. Our Vietnamese American communities who came here as refugees, our Indian American communities, in Central PA, a lot of the Indian American community, they work for Deloitte in their IT jobs. They work for the state, things like that. Those are going to be very different health outcomes, housing issues, everything on labor issues, everything under the sun than our refugees and our undocumented immigrant communities. And if we don't have the data to back that up, because everyone's being lumped under the word Asian, then we're not actually able to address these systemic issues. If our folks aren't actually accurately represented when we're doing surveys and data collection, then it's fundamentally impossible for us to actually get in there and fix these things. On the positive representation, I'd say, obviously, we're a political and electoral organization, so I'm thinking about candidates and politicians and things like that. And I do think that we're starting to see a sea change, both in terms of Asian candidates broadly and then queer Asians specifically, in terms of, frankly, the political calculus around our communities changing and folks outside our communities finally seeing us as actually viable and winnable candidates. I think about, what's happening in New Jersey next door, where we're seeing Asian American candidates run and win in 80%, 95% white districts. And, they were told when they first started running that there was no chance that they would win because they just look so different from the communities that they have grown up in their entire lives. but they're running and winning, and they're showing that actually our folks are, just as quote unquote American and just as quote unquote un-American as anyone else. And that actually it's folks' lived experiences and their politics and their policies that are going to get someone to back them, not just the color of their skin or not just how quote unquote foreign their name is or quote unquote American their name is. I think we have a lot to change, but I think the next step, frankly, is going beyond just being excited about representation on screen, in the state capitol, in the White House, and actually digging into what is the message that is being sent. Is it, a new Asian American that is going to support bombings overseas and police departments here at the expense of our Black and Brown and Asian and undocumented communities? Is it someone, on screen who is playing a character who looks like us, but is fundamentally not in line with our values, or, as part of a production that is anti-union, or again, fundamentally divorced from what our communities actually want and need? Or is it representation that actually shows not just us as people, but also our lived experiences, our day-to-day struggle, and just the history of our communities and everything we've gone through in this country? And I think that is really the next step in the representation conversation. It's not just seeing people who look like us on screen, but seeing our actual experiences and needs show up on screen too.
Absolutely. Quinn, any final thoughts here?
I'm in total agreement with Mohan. It's like, yeah. I also think that talking about our history in this country is really important too. Like, people still don't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or that one of the first slave ships over here to Philadelphia were Indian slaves. Like, we've been in this country a long time, and we're still treated like foreigners.
And that's a whole other conversation. Segment 2, right? Well, this concludes our special conversation tonight. And I want to thank Mohan Seshadri and Quynh-Mai Nguyen for their time and their insight. We hope you've learned a thing or two as well. And we encourage you to learn more about each of our organizations. We'll have more information at the end of this video. From Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, I'm Jiwanmall. Stay safe wherever you are, and have a very happy Asian Pacific and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Have a great night.